A crisp, white envelope with the embossed seal of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association lay on the reclaimed wood of Alex's kitchen counter, a stark and unsettling contrast to the warm, earthy tones of his eco-friendly home. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the familiar, pretentious oak leaf logo, a symbol he had once seen as a sign of a well-maintained, orderly community. That feeling was long gone. The notice inside, a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper, contained a demand so audacious it took his breath away, a chilling edict that seemed to spit on every principle he held dear. It wasn't a warning about an unkempt lawn or a misplaced garbage can. It was an order for a full-scale renovation, a directive to undo the very soul of his home, his life's work, a certified green building that was a testament to his career and his ideals. Alex, a passionate environmental architect, had spent 3 years of his life and his entire savings pouring every ounce of his creativity into this single-story marvel. He had engineered it to be a fortress of sustainability, a model of what modern living could and should be. The exterior siding was crafted from locally sourced, reclaimed barnwood, its withered gray patina a beautiful mosaic of history. The roof was a seamless array of photovoltaic solar panels that gleamed under the Arizona sun, not only generating all his power, but selling the excess back to the grid. A state-of-the-art rainwater collection system was subtly integrated into the design, feeding a drought-tolerant garden of native plants and succulents that bloomed with vibrant purples and oranges. This wasn't just a house, it was a living, breathing machine, a certified LEED Platinum residence, the highest level of green building recognition. It was a monument to his belief that design and nature could coexist in perfect harmony. But to the HOA, and specifically to its president, the perpetually scowling Ms. Evelyn Thompson, it was an abomination. Miss Thompson, a woman whose meticulously manicured lawn was a symbol of her control and her staunch belief in conformity, had always viewed Alex's home with thinly veiled disdain. She was a relic of a bygone era, a woman who saw progress not as innovation, but as an unwelcome deviation from the neighborhood's perfectly uniform beige and white color palette and manicured green lawns that devoured water in a desert climate. The HOA's rules, a dusty tome of outdated bylaws, were her personal Bible, and she wielded them like a weapon. The notice Alex held in his hand was the first shot in what was clearly going to be a war. It cited several vague clauses under the heading of aesthetic and architectural harmony, phrases like unauthorized deviation from approved residential standards and disruption of community visual cohesion. The notice, stamped with a terrifyingly official date of 30 days from receipt, demanded that Alex replace the reclaimed wood siding with approved stucco, remove the solar panels as they were an eyesore, and re-landscape his garden with community-approved non-native grass, a task that was not only financially impossible but morally repugnant. The penalty for noncompliance was a staggering fine of $100 per day, a sum that would quickly cripple him. Alex's initial disbelief gave way to a cold, hard anger. He had gone through the proper channels, submitting his plans years ago, receiving a lukewarm but ultimately apathetic approval from a different, far less draconian HOA board. Thompson, it seemed, had been waiting for her opportunity, using the vagueness of the rule book to target Alex's home not as a simple violation, but as a symbolic challenge to her authority and to the very idea of progress that Alex's home represented. The demand wasn't about a renovation, it was about forcing conformity, a demand to strip his home of its identity and crush his spirit. As he reread the notice, the bold red lettering on the fine section seemed to burn into the paper, and Alex knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he wasn't just fighting a neighborhood dispute. He was fighting a deliberate and personal attack orchestrated by a woman who saw his very existence an offense. Alex sat at the large, polished mahogany table, the gleaming surface a stark contrast to the rough, reclaimed wood of his own dining table back home. The air in the community center's meeting room was thick with the scent of old carpet and unspoken hostility. Across from him sat the 5-member HOA board, a jury of his peers who seemed to have already passed their verdict. At the head of the table, Miss Thompson presided with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, her perfectly pressed suit a physical representation of the rigid conformity she championed. Alex had come prepared. He had spent the entire week since receiving the notice gathering his evidence, meticulously organizing a thick binder filled with official documents, blueprints, and certifications. He was a man of reason, a man who believed that facts and logic would prevail over petty grievances. He placed the binder on the table, its weight a symbol of his hard work and dedication. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex began, his voice steady despite the tremor of anxiety in his stomach, "I've come to present my case. My home, far from being a violation, is a certified LEED Platinum residence. It's the highest possible rating for a green building. Here are the official certifications from the U.S. Green Building Council, the blueprints approved by the city, and a detailed report on how every element of my home, from the solar panels to the reclaimed siding, meets or exceeds modern building standards." He slid the binder toward Miss Thompson, who didn't even bother to open it. Instead, she simply pushed it back across the table, the sharp thud of the binder on the wood a punctuation mark on her disdain. "Mr. Harrison," Thompson said, her voice a low, gravelly monotone, "we appreciate your effort, but the rules of this association not concerned with green building or LEED Platinum. They are concerned with the aesthetic harmony of our community. Your home, with its mismatched wood siding and obtrusive panels, is in clear violation of Article 7, subsection C, which states that all external modifications must be in keeping with the prevailing architectural style of the neighborhood." The other board members murmured in agreement, their faces impassive, a collective brick wall of indifference. Alex felt a cold knot form in his gut, the prevailing architectural style. The neighborhood was a mix of suburban tract homes from the late 80s and early 90s, a mishmash of beige stucco and Spanish tile roofs. There was no style, only a bland, uninspired uniformity that he had dared to challenge. He pointed to the documents in his binder. "But the previous board approved my plans. They signed off on them years ago." Thompson chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, "a mistake, which the current board is now correcting. Our bylaws state that the board has the right to reevaluate and correct previous decisions that are found to be in violation of the spirit of the association's rules. The spirit, Mr. Harrison, is conformity, and your house, with all its green bells and whistles, is anything but." The meeting devolved from there. Alex, in his desperation, tried to appeal to their sense of reason, their responsibility to the environment, even their sense of community. He explained how his solar panels benefited the entire neighborhood by reducing strain on the local power grid. He detailed how his native landscaping used a fraction of the water of a traditional lawn, a crucial consideration in their arid climate. But his words fell on deaf ears. Miss Thompson simply kept repeating the same phrases, like a broken record: prevailing architectural style, community cohesion, unauthorized deviation. The other board members simply nodded along, their collective will seeming to be completely dominated by their leader. Alex realized, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't about the rules. It was about power. It was about Thompson's need to assert control, to make an example of anyone who dared to be different. The fine print of the HOA's notice was a legalistic facade for a personal vendetta. His attempts at a peaceful resolution had failed, and the door to a reasonable conversation had been slammed shut in his face. He felt a wave of frustration so intense it made him dizzy. This was a battle he was going to have to fight on their terms, not his. He was not just fighting an HOA. He was fighting a bully who was using the system to her advantage. The meeting ended with Thompson presenting Alex with a final, updated notice. The daily fine had been doubled, and a new clause was added, stating that if the renovations were not started within 60 days, the HOA would initiate legal action to enforce compliance, and Alex would be responsible for all legal fees. Walking out of the community center, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the manicured lawns. Alex felt a renewed sense of purpose, born from the ashes of his failed attempt at diplomacy. He had been so focused on proving his house was a model of sustainability that he had missed the real conflict entirely. His suspicion, once a quiet whisper in his mind, now screamed at him. There was something more going on here than just a simple dislike for his home's aesthetic. He had to dig deeper. He had to understand why Thompson was so dead set on tearing down his home, on undoing his life's work. The key was in the details, buried deep within the HOA's bylaws. He had read them dozens of times, but perhaps he had missed something, a loophole or a hidden clause that Thompson was exploiting. He decided to go back to the source, to the town hall and the county records, to see if there were any public records of the HOA's formation, its land deeds, or any of its past dealings. He needed to find out who Miss Thompson really was, what her history with the association was, and what she truly stood to gain from making Alex's life a living hell. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet, elderly woman who had always been kind to him. The message was simple but chilling. "Be careful, Alex. Thompson has a way of getting what she wants, and she's not afraid to play dirty." It was the final piece of the puzzle, the confirmation that this was a battle of wills, not a disagreement over aesthetics. His investigation had to begin now, before the HOA's legal machine could start to grind him to dust. He was no longer just a homeowner fighting to save his house. He was a detective searching for the truth, a truth he was certain would lead back to the very person who had just so confidently rejected his pleas, Miss Thompson. The fight was just beginning, and Alex was ready to dig in and uncover the conspiracy he was sure was bubbling just beneath the perfectly manicured surface of his neighborhood. Alex spent the next 2 weeks living in a state of hypervigilance, his life a chaotic mix of architectural work, furious research, and an ever-present knot of dread in his stomach. The stack of unopened bills from the HOA sat on his counter, a silent but growing threat. He had hit a wall in his solo investigation, finding nothing but dead ends in the dusty, public records archives. The HOA's legal filings were a tangled mess of legalese, designed to be impenetrable to the average person. But a lifeline came from an unexpected source, an email from Mrs. Gable, the kind, elderly neighbor who had warned him. She had invited him over for tea, a seemingly innocent gesture that Alex knew held a deeper meaning. As he sat in her cozy living room, surrounded by porcelain figurines and the scent of Earl Grey, Mrs. Gable revealed that he wasn't the first person Thompson had targeted. She told him about an elderly couple who had been forced to sell their home to a development company at a steep discount that the HOA had levied years of fines for a non-compliant fence. They couldn't afford the legal battle, so they had given in. The developer, a company called Havenwood Construction. The name rang a bell. Alex's mind immediately flashed back to a brochure he had seen in Miss Thompson's hand at the last community meeting. It was from Havenwood Construction. The connection, once a whisper, was now a loud, insistent shout. Inspired, Alex sent out a carefully worded email to a few other residents he had noticed seemed frustrated with the HOA. He didn't mention his specific issue, instead framing it as an open discussion about the rising costs and strict enforcement of the bylaws. To his surprise, 3 people responded. First was Maria, a young woman who worked from home as a graphic designer and was being hounded by the HOA to take down her wind chime, which was deemed a nuisance. Second was Robert, a retired plumber who was being fined for his perfectly maintained vegetable garden, which Thompson insisted was an unapproved agricultural use of residential property. The third was an older gentleman named Arthur, a former history teacher who had been a resident for over 30 years. Arthur, it turned out, had a treasure trove of old HOA documents, including meeting minutes and financial reports that went back to the neighborhood's founding. He had saved them all out of a personal fascination with the neighborhood's history. never thinking they would be needed for a fight. They all met at Alex's home, a sanctuary of sustainable design that now served as a war room. Alex presented his theory. Thompson was deliberately using vague bylaws to harass residents, forcing them into costly legal battles or, more likely, to sell their properties to a specific company. The discovery of the Havenwood construction connection made everything click into place. Maria's wind chime and Robert's garden were just pretexts, smaller-scale versions of the pressure Thompson was putting on Alex. Their alliance, fueled by a shared sense of injustice, quickly became a well-oiled machine. Arthur, with his meticulous records, found dozens of instances over the past 5 years where Thompson had targeted residents for minor infractions, forcing them to spend thousands on fines or legal fees. Robert, using his network of local tradesmen, managed to get a friend who worked at the city's building permits office to discreetly look into Havenwood construction. He discovered that the company had a suspiciously high number of permits for renovations and remodels in their neighborhood, almost always on homes that had been recently sold. The pattern was undeniable. Meanwhile, Maria, with her digital skills, created a secure online forum for the group and started digging into the corporate records of Havenwood construction. She found a shocking detail. The company's CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, was Thompson's brother-in-law. The link was no longer circumstantial. It was a clear-cut case of corruption and nepotism. The renovation demands were nothing more than a legalistic shakedown, a way to devalue properties and drive out residents who wouldn't conform, making them easy targets for Thorne's development company. The stakes were no longer just about Alex's home, they were about the very future of the neighborhood. The plan, they all realized, was to systematically devalue properties, push out long-time residents, and then, eventually, tear down the old homes to build new, more expensive ones, reaping a massive profit for Thompson and her brother-in-law. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Arthur found a handwritten note in a box of old meeting minutes from 5 years prior. It was a note from a previous HOA board member, expressing concern about Thompson pushing to change the bylaws to be more vague and enforceable. The note ended with a scribbled, damning phrase, "Thompson's got big plans. She's talking to her brother-in-law about a major opportunity for the neighborhood." The evidence was overwhelming, a paper trail of harassment, a direct, familial link to a construction company, and a clear history of manipulating the bylaws for personal gain. The conspiracy wasn't a paranoid theory, it was a cold, hard fact. They had enough to take to a lawyer, and enough to present to the entire community, should it come to that. But they knew Thompson would fight back with everything she had. She had control of the HOA's legal funds and the authority to levy fines that could bankrupt them all. The game had changed. It was no longer about saving a single home, but about a community fighting for its right to exist, its right to be free from the oppressive grip of a corrupt leader and her hidden agenda. The quiet sanctuary of Alex's home, once a symbol of his sustainable dream, had now become the fortress of an emerging resistance. They had the truth, but getting the community to believe it and act on it would be the hardest battle of all. The morning light streaming into Alex's kitchen was cold and unforgiving as he stared at the official-looking letter. It wasn't a fine notice this time. It was a cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal counsel, delivered by a grim-faced process server. The document was a masterpiece of intimidation, accusing him of slander, defamation, and disrupting community peace. It demanded that he immediately stop all communication with other residents regarding the HOA's actions and pay all legal fees for the HOA's damages. The letter was a clear attempt to silence him and his newfound allies, a legal maneuver designed to drain their resources and break their spirits before they could expose the truth. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, but a strange sense of calm settled over him. He knew this was coming. It was Miss Thompson's final play, a desperate act by a woman who knew she was cornered. He immediately sent a message to his allies Maria, Robert, and Arthur calling for an emergency meeting at his house. They gathered around Alex's kitchen island, the legal threat a palpable weight in the room. Maria, ever the pragmatist, was visibly shaken. "This is it, Alex. They're going for broke. We need a lawyer, and we don't have the money to fight an association with a full legal team." Robert, however, was defiant. "They can't scare us. We have the truth on our side." Arthur, the oldest and wisest among them, simply nodded, his eyes narrowed in thought. "The truth is a powerful weapon, but only if it's wielded correctly. We need to use it to expose them publicly before they can bury us in legal fees." That's when Alex revealed his final piece of research. In a late-night session poring over the town's historical archives, he had discovered something that made the land deal infinitely more sinister than a simple get-rich-quick scheme. He unrolled a large, faded topographical map on the counter, its creases a road map of the neighborhood's history. "I've been looking into the land records," Alex explained, his voice low and intense, "and I found something about the parcel of land next to our community, the one Ms. Thompson's brother-in-law, Marcus Thorne, just acquired for his new development." He pointed to a small, almost imperceptible symbol on the old map, a mark indicating an old industrial site. This land was a testing ground for an old pesticide manufacturer in the 1960s. The site was shut down for contaminating the soil and groundwater. It was supposed to have been remediated, but I found some old, sealed reports that were buried in the archives. They indicate that the cleanup was never fully completed. The soil is still toxic. The group stared at the map in stunned silence. The HOA's demand for Alex to remove his eco-friendly features, the rainwater collection system, the native plants that acted as natural soil filters, was no longer just about aesthetics. It was a cover-up Ms. Thompson was trying to silence. The one home in the neighborhood that could unintentionally expose the environmental hazard. Alex's home, with its sensitive filtration systems and careful attention to the soil, was a silent sentinel, a potential whistleblower to a toxic secret that could devalue the entire neighborhood and get Thompson and Thorne in a world of legal trouble. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. As Alex was researching the old pesticide company, he found a long-forgotten news clipping from 50 years ago. It was an obituary for the company's former CEO, a woman who had died in a small plane crash. A passenger had also been killed in the crash, a young man who was an architectural apprentice and a vocal critic of the company's lax environmental standards. The name of the apprentice was Robert Thompson, Ms. Thompson's younger brother. A collective gasp filled the room. The silence was deafening as they all processed the stunning revelation. Ms. Thompson's vendetta against Alex's eco-friendly home wasn't just about money or power. It was personal. She saw Alex, a young, idealistic, environmental architect with a passion for green building, as a painful reminder of her brother's tragic death. She wasn't just trying to force conformity. She was trying to erase a ghost from her past, lashing out at Alex as if he were a proxy for a history she could never change. The legal threats, the fines, the relentless harassment, it was all a symptom of a deeply rooted, decades-long grief and rage. The twisted plot was now complete, a corrupt land deal to profit from a toxic site, a cover-up to hide an environmental hazard, and a personal vendetta rooted in a family tragedy. They had all the pieces, enough to bring Thompson's entire world crashing down. But, as the group sat in stunned silence, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the police or another process server. It was a large, imposing man with a cold, piercing gaze and a leather briefcase. It was Marcus Thorne, Thompson's brother-in-law, and he had come to deliver a final, chilling message. "I hear you've been doing some digging," he said, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "I've also heard you've been spreading some very dangerous rumors." He pulled a thick folder from his briefcase, a folder that held photos of Alex's family, his friends, and even his colleagues. "Let's just say, you've gone too far. This ends now." The story was no longer just a legal battle. It was a dangerous game against a powerful enemy with everything to lose. The community now knew the truth. but they were standing on a powder keg, and the match had just been lit. The community center was a pressure cooker, 100 neighbors crammed into a space built for 50. A sea of anxious faces filled the plastic chairs, a palpable tension hanging in the air. At the front of the room, Miss Thompson sat with an almost unnerving calm, flanked by the remaining two loyal board members, who fidgeted nervously with their notepads. She had called this special meeting herself, a final power play, intending to use the HOA's legal threat to publicly silence Alex and his troublemaking allies once and for all. But as Alex, Maria, Robert, and Arthur entered the room and took their seats, there was a silent shift. The community wasn't just here to be lectured, they were here to see a fight. Arthur, with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen it all, stood first. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the years. "I've been a resident here for over 30 years, he began, "and I've seen the spirit of this community, a spirit of neighborliness, be replaced by fear and intimidation." Thompson scoffed, "If you have an agenda, Arthur, get to the point." Alex rose to his feet, a thick binder and the old topographical map in his hands. He looked directly at Thompson, his gaze unwavering. "My agenda is the truth," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I'm here to tell you that this isn't about my home's siding or my solar panels. It's about a systematic, corrupt effort to take control of this neighborhood for a fraudulent land deal." He then proceeded to lay out the entire scheme. Calmly and methodically, he started with the pattern of harassment, calling on Maria and Robert to share their own stories, which they did with a renewed sense of courage. He showed them the evidence of the financial link between Miss Thompson and her brother-in-law, Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Havenwood Construction. He detailed how the demands for renovations were a deliberate effort to devalue properties, making them easy targets for a company that had been buying up homes at an alarming rate. A low murmur of shock rippled through the crowd, but Alex wasn't finished. He unrolled the old, faded map on a table for everyone to see. "But the corruption is even deeper than that," he continued, his voice gaining momentum. "The real motive behind all this is a cover-up. Thorne's company isn't just building new homes, they're acquiring the land next to our community, a toxic site that was never fully remediated. My home, with its green building features, was a threat to them because it could have exposed that environmental hazard and put the entire land deal in jeopardy." The murmuring turned to gasps of disbelief, then to outrage. The full scope of the deception was dawning on them. All their health, their financial security, their entire community was being put at risk for Thompson's profit. Thompson, now red-faced and sputtering, slammed her fist on the table. "This is slander. Lies. He's just trying to avoid paying his fines." But her words were powerless against the truth that was now laid bare. As the crowd began to shout questions, Alex delivered the final, devastating blow. He produced the news clipping about the plane crash from 50 years ago. "And finally," he said, holding up the fragile piece of paper, "I discovered the root of Miss Thompson's personal vendetta against my green home." The second victim in this plane crash was a young environmental architect named Robert Thompson, her brother. My home, a symbol of everything her brother believed in, became a target for a woman who has been quietly grieving and filled with rage for 50 years. This wasn't just about money. It was about destroying a legacy she couldn't face. A stunned silence fell over the room. The anger and confusion transformed into a shared sense of empathy and disbelief. The woman who had been a neighborhood bully was now revealed to be a broken woman, consumed by a decades-old tragedy. The community's anger, however, did not waver. It simply refocused. They no longer saw a petty tyrant. They saw a dangerous, corrupt leader who had put them all at risk because of her own personal pain. The room erupted, one by one. Neighbors who had long been silent began to stand up and share their stories. The woman whose rose bushes were deemed too high, the man who was fined for having a basketball hoop on his garage. The collective injustice of it all washed over the room, and the spirit of community, which had been dormant for so long, reawakened with a fiery passion. The timid Mrs. Peterson, the lone woman on the board, found her voice, rising from her chair and pointing a shaking finger. At Thompson, you were meant to serve this community, not yourself, she declared. I'm not a part of this anymore. She then formally resigned from the board on the spot. With her allies crumbling and the community in open revolt, Thompson's composure finally broke. She stood up, trembling with rage, and tried to shout them down, but her words were lost in the wave of a collective chant, "Vote her out, vote her out." A motion was made, seconded, and passed with a deafening chorus of ayes. In a single moment, with the roar of the community, Miss Thompson's reign of terror came to an end. She was stripped of her title, and with her legal threats now toothless, she was left standing alone, a defeated woman in the center of a room full of people who had finally found their voice. The next hour was a blur of joyful chaos. Alex, Maria, Robert, and Arthur were elected to form a new interim board. A plan was put in place to address the toxic land issue and begin the healing process for the neighborhood. Alex's home, once a point of contention, was now seen as a symbol of their victory. The next day, Alex woke up to the sun streaming through his window, the photovoltaic panels on his roof quietly generating clean energy. He walked outside and saw a sight that brought a genuine smile to his face. His neighbors, a mix of old and new residents, were gathered in his yard, helping him plant new native flowers. The fines had been rescinded, the legal threats were gone, and the community was now bound not by conformity, but by a shared purpose. The spirit of the neighborhood had been restored, and his home, a certified green building, now stood as a proud monument to their resilience and the power of truth.